That's odd. So inside. So. Yeah.
Okay, folks, it is 10:01. I want to thank you for joining this Great Lakes 101 for Lake Erie in New York State. This is a training on coastal permitting, a little background on coastal geology and the reasons a lot of these regulations are in place. So my co-hosts, if you guys want to continue to if my co-hosts want to continue letting people in as they come in late, then that's great. I'm going to close a couple things. So I'm going to have to leave it up to you. There's a lot of stuff on my screen right now. Okay. So let's get rid of that. And I am just going to get right into it. So just want to let you guys know that this meeting is going to be recorded for those that could not attend. And also those that want to come back and view some of the information later on, because there's going to be a lot of information today, so you might want to come back and take a look at it afterwards. So we just want to make sure that all the information is available to those who want it. We're going to try to make sure everybody is muted so that we don't have a lot of feedback. So please don't be offended if I do mute you. It's just to make sure everybody can hear the information. You are free to ask questions throughout, but there will be a Q&A session at the end. So feel free to ask questions whenever you feel the urge to do so. And I do want to mention and acknowledge that New York State DEC is the funder for this, and we are very grateful for that. On the agenda today is myself. My name is Roy Woodring. I'm a New York Sea Grant, Great Lakes Coastal Processes and Hazard Specialist here. I'm at SUNY Oswego, so I work both Lake Erie and Lake Ontario in the connecting waters. We will hear from David Dink and Beth Geldar from New York State DEC on their part of the permitting process. Also Matt Miraglio and Peter Bazan from New York State Department of State, and Steve Mativier from United States Army Corps of Engineers. Okay. So why are we here today? Well, we've been talking a lot amongst ourselves about what needs are out there, and what continues to come up is that we really want the public to have a better background on the permitting processes, not just the process of it, but why certain regulations are in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the coastal geology and the ecosystems and what that looks like as that factors into the permitting process, why we want to maintain certain parts of the shoreline certain ways. We'll look at successful permit applications, the process, and talk about local, state, and federal perspectives on all of these. And then we'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end. So Great Lakes coastal processes, what are those? Essentially, coastal processes are the interactions between wind, waves, shorelines, and how that moves sediment along the shoreline. Really, how there is erosion and accretion at the shorelines, and how and what are the driving factors behind those processes. So shoreline types, the wind, the waves, water levels all factor into these, and we want to make sure that when we're planning shoreline projects, we're getting a good idea of how these processes work together and how we can make nice, healthy shorelines. I see a lot of people in the waiting room, so I'm just going to add a few quickly, and we'll move on. So why these processes matter? Really, it's there's a lot of connections on the shoreline, both ecological and geological, and we want to conserve the shoreline environment to make sure that the processes are functioning as they should be, because that really what's happening at one shoreline is going to affect what's happening up and down drift. And when I say down drift, that's the way the sediment is usually moving along the shoreline in a standard way. We want to maintain those processes. We want to limit a lot of other byproducts of these processes, such as wave deflection, scour at the base of structures, and so on. So scour is usually that process where the waves come in, they hit a vertical wall and they kind of mine underneath or in front of the structure. So that's one thing we want to do, both for the structural integrity of the walls, if they are in place as a wall or other type of shoreline revetment, but also because by preventing scour, we can maintain a beach out in front of a property or a natural area. When I refer to obstruction, I mean kind of what's in this upper left of the lower diagram there. When we build perpendicular out into the lake, we could often trap sediment in one area, and that means that down drift, down like not so much the current, but like the process of down drift. But we want to make sure that all of the beaches and shorelines are receiving all that sediment. So that's a big factor. Reflection is also very big, because when you have a situation where one stretch of property is protected by a large wall or revetment, neighboring properties can also see issues with that by receiving that reflected erosion. And that's when I do site visits with property owners, that's what I often see. Someone builds a wall, but the neighboring property starts to erode much quicker. All right, so we're going to talk about shoreline types, and this is really where my specialty is, the coastal geology and the processes, and how we want to maintain certain processes on the lake shore. So Lake Erie is really mostly known for, and what I see a lot of coming from the residents is bedrock cliffs, mostly shale and kind of this limestone type sediments. The erosion resistance of these is very high where the rock is exposed. I don't see a whole lot of erosion of the rock itself, except for freeze thaw, cracking, and so on. But we do see and have seen since, especially since 2019, a loss of the beach in front of these. A lot of cleaning up of these bluffs, so that used to be covered in sediment, are now very much exposed to the lake's waves. But also, almost every site visit I've done on Lake Erie in the past 2 years has actually had issues above the shoreline, above the cliffs themselves, and the erosions happening on the bluff on top of it. So we're really concerned with the neighboring properties in terms of the bedrock cliffs. Bluffs, these can either be perched on top of the hard bedrock outcrops on the shoreline, or they could be like we see here in Dunkirk, perched on top of actually a sandy shoreline. These are very common. We see a lot of erosion on these, especially during like SAISH events and high wind events and high water levels on Lake Erie. So this is where a lot of our concern is right now for the erosion that is happening. And as you can see, it tends to happen very quickly. It's a lot more dangerous to be, say, on top of this bluff and, step out to the edge and there's an overhang. So they are a bit more hazardous than other situations, and then tend to be really storm-driven erosion events, and also winter weather. So a lot of freeze thaw, a lot of slow earth moving when those the surface of those bluffs start to freeze, and then they melt, and then they kind of slide down a little bit. We see this on both lakes, but especially quite a bit on Lake Erie late. This is really the same beach, just a little bit farther down, where it's actually more of a shaly, rocky area. These are pretty abundant as well. They're really a lot more dynamic than we give them credit for. They're also often associated with small streams and rivers. So like I think some of the shoreline access parts that we have on Lake Erie, they often have a shore where a lot of the sediment is, a lot of the core sediment actually washes down from that, or it comes in from the lakeside. So pretty dynamic, and they're going to respond differently to different events in different ways. So we tend to see higher erosion rates here, but there are also pretty important shoreline habitats for shoreline birds, fish spawning out into the water, not necessarily on the shoreline itself. But these are a large source of downdrift material. So a lot of the waves are pulling sediments off the beach and moving them farther down the lake shore. So they are very important for maintaining that sediment supply to the shoreline. Also, and this is much more rare on Lake Erie, we do have shoreline types of sandy beaches and dunes. Again, these are very ecologically fragile, so we want to make sure that we have enough sediment to keep supplying these, but also that know that they are supplying sediments to back out to the lake that may maintain beaches farther down, which could be those shaly sandy beaches and not necessarily more dunes. Very vulnerable to losing a lot of sediment and putting itself, many decades behind during these very intense erosion events. Very important coastal habitats for a lot of specific species. Weather tends to be one of the driving factors, and I say tends to be, but it really is the driving factor behind erosion on Lake Erie. One of those biggest events, and I'm just going to go back and so that replays again, everybody gets a chance to see it. Seiche has been seemingly more common in recent years, and this is when you get a lot of strong winds coming across the long axis of Lake Erie to the point where the water just really piles up on the eastern portion of the lake, and this tends to cause a lot of change in the shoreline environment. So when we think about these shoreline projects, we really want to make sure that if we are protecting an important asset from these Seiche events, are we planning for what they used to look like, or are we planning for them a little bit more often? And are we not just planning for them right at the shoreline interface, but are we planning for them upland as well? And I want to get into that in a little bit here. So on Lake Erie, we have a ton of different ways in which we have pursued managing shoreline erosion. As you can see from this shot, we have curved walls, we have rock piles, we have cement poured walls, beaches. There's a lot going on, and we want to make sure that what we're selecting for certain areas is going to be most effective for those areas, and not just, my neighbor has this, so that's what I want to put in. And we want to make sure that they're reacting with the environment the way that they should be. So this is an example from down in Chautauqua County, where there was an issue, not really an issue, but this really was just the dumping area. So I don't think any the focus was put into what this was going to do, but by pouring these large cement waste material over the shoreline and into the lake, it actually caused an area where the waves were reflecting into an unprotected part of the shoreline and caused some significant erosion during the winter. This is about, actually, I think it was last winter where this happened mostly. So a lot of these things take time to actually become exposed, but there's usually some sort of driver behind this. In this case, it was Seiche events, but also on top of that, high water levels as well. I mentioned earlier that managing the water on top of the shoreline bluffs has become a really big issue. I would say more than 75% of the site visits I've done, the issue wasn't so much with the lake itself, but with the way water was being managed on top of these bluffs. So here's an example from about halfway down the New York portion of the lake, where there was a lot of water coming off Route 5, which was only about 50 feet behind where I was taking this picture. And the water just flowed off in sheets. It overwhelmed the ditches and started to flow across the lawns. As you can see, there's also some tree removal here as well, so that doesn't help. But there's kind of this shoddy work done to try to get this drainage tile put in. Not really best craftsmanship here, but water was pooling on top of this and falling over the bluff on top of this shallow area and creating a really uncomfortable shoreline erosion situation where there's really no space for the homeowner to work with here. So this becomes a situation where we're not managing the erosion from the lake, but we're actually managing the water coming off the land and how that reacts with the environment. So I do want to talk a little bit about long-term changes. As I've mentioned a few times, Seiche has been a lot worse in recent years. So there are weather patterns that we need to discuss and how they're changing and how that's going to impact the way we plan for shoreline erosion in the future. Couple of these events include heavier precipitation events. We've already seen this happen quite a bit, and that could lead to more of these these upland erosion type events that are becoming a bit of an issue, and also the water storage issue of lawns. We want to make sure that they're being drained properly. The freeze thaw cycles in the winter. This is actually interesting because we're in like a third La Nina event, so mild, but also heavy precipitation winter in the Northeast. We get a lot of cases where the ground freezes, thaws, and that actually, in many cases, causes the bluff material to slide down quite often. One thing we're not really sure what it's going to look like yet is a higher evapotranspiration in the summer. So it's much hotter and much windier in the summer. And that's leads to maybe potentially a drop in lake levels from, just removing water from the lake, but it also more wind and wave events, which are going to, influence the shoreline more. Lake effect snow, we just got off a historical Western New York snowfall event. That water from that snow has to go somewhere. So when that melts, and when those events happen in November and December, where they probably will melt, that's a lot of land to. It's not a whole lot of land to drain a whole lot of water at once. So that's something we want to keep an eye on. And as I mentioned earlier, stage events as well. So I do want to quickly get into resources that are currently available for contractors and how to access those. A lot of this is going to come out later, but I'll get right into it. Steve, hopefully we'll be able to talk about this a little bit later, but there is these new guides from the Army Corps of Engineers, the Engineering with Nature guides. These are really comprehensive ways to design shoreline projects, which are much more environmentally sustainable, that maintain those shoreline processes a lot better than what we've done for the past 40 or 50 years. So that's the big one. We also do have a Working with Nature guide through New York Sea Grant if you are going to pursue nature-based type solutions. There are some cases where, we have a bedrock cliff. There's not a whole lot we can do with a few plantings here and there, but we do want to make this a little bit more prevalent in the way that we are thinking about shoreline management. We have DOS, DEC, and Army Corps on the call today. So if there are resources of a certain type that you are looking for, please let us know, and we can either find those for you or we can work together to develop other resources that maybe do not exist quite yet. So feel free to contact the speakers, or if you want to go through me, my contact is at some point here. But if you all received an email from me, if you're registered, please just respond to me if there's something you would like to see, and we'll do our best to get that out or get it developed. So we are on Zoom today. That was not our original plan. That's just the way it kind of shook out for this year. We do want to do these workshops in person so that we can really interact with everyone. And we'd like to do them a little bit more focused than, Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. So a couple subregions could be Erie, Chautauqua, Niagara, Orleans, Southern, South Central, Lake Ontario, Finger Lakes, Eastern Lake Ontario, St. Lawrence River, and potentially even Niagara River as well. So I see a couple bits in the chat here that I'm going to take a look at real quick. Not sure if that was mentioned or not. This is my last slide, so I'm going to stop sharing. And at this point, I am going to hand it off to David Dink with New York State DEC, and he is going to co-present with Beth Geldard, also with DEC. So I see a question about the GIF from Noah that I showed. it took me about a few months, but if you try hard enough, you do Lake Erie Seiche GIF. I believe it was posted through Clairol or NOAA, but I'm not entirely sure. But I can, Justin Steinbeck, I can send that to you directly if you'd like. What's that? And with that, let's go to David.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome, great. So good morning, everybody, and thanks to Roy and Sea Grant and for our other agency partners here and for getting the workshop together. Can you see my screen? Can you see the slideshow?
Yes.
All right, very good. So my name is Dave Dank. I'm with the DEC Division of Environmental Permits in Region 9 office in Buffalo. My staff and I help to manage and process permit applications for work along Lake Erie in Chautauqua County and Erie County. So I want to talk about the three main ways that DEC issues permits for shoreline protection, other shoreline type of projects, that might be out there along Lake Erie. So the options that are available are the general permit, an individual permit, and an emergency permit. The general permit is available for a variety of situations. I believe there's about 10 different kinds of general permit categories that are covered under that. It's the simplest way to get a permit. And of course, simple and easy is good, right? An emergency permit is available for situations where there's an immediate threat to life or property, such as like a house falling into the lake. We've issued some of these approvals after the Halloween windstorm a few years ago, where there was structural damage and immediate things had to happen to protect those properties. The individual permit is the normal standard process for permitting other types of activities. So the Great Lakes Erosion Control General Permit is the quickest and easiest way of getting authorization to do shoreline work, but it only works for a certain set of activities, and I'll run through all those activities. When we talk to somebody on the telephone who needs to do work along the lake, we try first to see if the project can fit under the general permit. This can really streamline the permitting process. One of the added benefits to using the general permit is that our colleagues at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and New York State Department of State have already signed off on these activities under this particular permit. And there's no need to send application materials to the Corps or to DOS. So what sorts of activities can be approved through the general permit? I think that, like I said, I think there's about 10 different categories. Repair and in-kind replacement of existing functional erosion protection structures. The repair or replacement of these structures must not extend waterward of the pre-existing footprint. Next, new sloped rock revetments of less than 100 feet necessary for the protection of existing and functional dwellings. So there's slope and height limits that apply. There has to be something on the property to protect. Repair or reconstruction of existing public roads, bridges, utilities, and other public infrastructure. This category would be most helpful for municipalities or agencies with infrastructure along the lake. Emergency repair of functional concrete or steel vertical break walls by installation of sheet piling immediately adjacent to lakeward vertical face. So the refacement of existing vertical structures. Minor grading of scarped bluffs to create a stable slope. The project must include an approved vegetation plan to help the newly graded area to become stabilized. The use of toe stone may be allowed. Repair or reconstruction of docks, catwalks, and floats that were functional on April 1st, 2017. Stabilization of existing functional storm damaged dwellings, decks, and walkways through the use of temporary bracing and pilings. repair or reconstruction of elevated walkways or stairways necessary for water access, removal of channel blockages on Lake Erie tributaries with upland disposal of removed materials. I'm sorry that says Lake Ontario, it should say Lake Erie. Removal of debris by use of motorized equipment. So if your project fits one of these categories, that's great. And we can get you going through the general permit process. So how do you apply? You would send by email or by regular mail to the regional DEC office a completed general permit application form, current photos of the project site. Photos before the damage occurred are also very helpful, and project plans. So both a site plan, that's like a top view, and a cross section of the project are necessary. Beth will be showing us a good example of project plans in her presentation, which is next. Like I mentioned before, if the project meets the general permit criteria, there is no need to send the application materials to the Corps or to Department of State. The application form is really pretty simple to fill out. It's just the 2 pages shown here on the slide. I know it's very difficult to read. It's really fine print. I'm sure you guys are not able to read it very well. This is all on the DEC webpage. So basically what we're looking for is contact information, the location of the project, an application contact or the contractor, if you have one, a description of the project, and you're signing off for permission for department staff to visit the property. Like I mentioned, the application should be accompanied by photos and project plans. Often the contractor for the resident is preparing some plans for the property owner as part of the proposal. If the project doesn't meet the general permit criteria, an individual permit would be required. Examples of activities where you might need an individual permit would be new shoreline protection structures greater than 100 feet in length, building in addition to a new structure in the coastal erosion hazard area, or work near regulated wetlands. The process is pretty similar to the general permit, although a joint application form would be used instead of the form for the general permit. It's more likely that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and DOS, Department of State, would also be involved. The application process can all be done online. If you go to the DEC website and search for coastal erosion application checklist, you'll get a page that has all the links you need to complete an application process. We would need the application form, the short environmental assessment form, current photos, and project plans. Emergency authorization is the next type of authorization the DEC issues. Like I said, we've issued a number of these after high water events and SAISH events, most notably after the Halloween storm a few years ago. So what do we need here? This is when there's an immediate threat to life, health, general welfare, property, or natural resources. DEC would be in a position to authorize only the minimum work necessary to overcome the emergency. That authorization would be good for 30 days and might be extended for another 30 days. This usually happens when emergency authorization is typically issued when there's been a major storm event, if somebody's house or boathouse or other structure is at risk of immediate failure. There's not a standard form to fill out for emergency authorization. We would need some sort of a letter or email explaining the emergency and a plan or description of what work is being proposed. If a structure is in danger of collapse without immediate intervention, please contact us as soon as possible, and we will work with you to get an emergency authorization. So in addition to the coastal erosion regulations, Part 505 of the conservation regulations, protection of waters is another common permit type that's issued along the lake. For work in Lake Erie below the mean high water level, a A protection of waters permit would also be required. Sometimes it's coastal erosion and a protection of waters permit issued at the same time. The protection of waters permit is issued in one of the three ways we discussed, the general permit, an individual permit, or an emergency authorization. Staff would be able to issue an Article 15 protection of waters permit if the project is reasonable and necessary, if the proposal does not endanger the health, safety, welfare of the people of the state of New York, and will not cause an unreasonable, uncontrolled, or unnecessary damage to the natural resources of the state. Like all of the DEC permit programs, we try to minimize environmental impacts of proposed projects as much as possible. Generally, new vertical walls would be discouraged. Green vegetative methods of shoreline protection are encouraged, and shoreline hardening is used only when necessary. Article 24 is the Freshwater Wetlands Act. Most of the time along Lake Erie, no wetlands permit would be required. There's probably just a few examples of those types of permits being necessary along the Lake Erie shoreline. The wetland regulations are in place to protect certain types of wetlands in New York State. Part 182 is the state's threatened and endangered species protection regulations. Again, for the wetlands permit and for the threatened and endangered permit, we work with people to try to minimize the impact to the wetlands or to the habitats of endangered and threatened species. Avoid, minimize those impacts, evaluate alternatives to the proposed project, demonstrate that there is a practical alternative. And then once all those things are done, we may have to have mitigation for unavoidable impacts. So for most projects on Lake Erie, these last two regulation types do not come into play. Usually it's the general permit and individual permits that we're dealing with the most. That is it for me. And for the next group of slides, I'll hand it over to Beth Geldard, DEC's coastal erosion engineer for this area. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Can hear you and I can see your slides.
Perfect. Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Beth Geldard. I work for New York State DEC in the Western Flood Hub section out of the Region 8 DEC Avon office. And I manage the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area program for Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, so DEC regions 6 through 9. I'm going to be talking about the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area permitting program, going through like our permit issuance standards, our application requirements, and then I'm also going to go through a permit application example, and that's going to show you the level of detail that we require when you submit a permit application for a regulated activity. Okay, so Article 34 Coastal Erosion Management Permit. This is the Article 34 permit is commonly needed for working along the Lake Erie shoreline. So it's all of Chautauqua County and Erie County up to the Niagara River. The primary purpose and intent of this program is really to promote and preserve the natural features along the lakeshore. So when I say natural features, I mean the nearshore area, beaches, dunes, bluffs, and to really limit the amount of development on these features to minimize the impacts caused from human development on the shoreline, and to really create like a buffer area between upland development and coastal processes to really keep structures safe from premature damages due to the flooding and erosion. Similarly to the Article 15 protection of waters and the wetlands permitting programs, there are permit issuance standards that a project must meet before we can issue a permit. So the activity has to be reasonable and necessary, considering alternatives to the proposed activity. We prefer, as a state agency, and recommend the use of softer shoreline stabilization methods over hard structural methods. So really the hard structural methods such as, your rock revetments and seawalls, those should really be used as a last resort. We would like to see, the use of other softer alternatives, even maybe some non-structural solutions such as moving at-risk structures away from the shoreline. Okay, and the project must not likely cause a measurable increase in erosion at the site or adjacent areas and prevent or minimize adverse effects to natural protective features, adjacent areas, even adjacent shoreline structures, and so forth. Okay, so the coastal erosion hazard area. How do you know if you are within a coastal erosion hazard area? Well, it all comes down to our coastal erosion hazard area maps. And basically our maps define where the coastal erosion hazard areas are. So that top image to the right, that red line going along the coastline along Lake Erie, this identifies where all of the regulated coastal erosion hazard areas are and where there are maps that define, exactly where it sits on a particular property. This map down here shows what a coastal erosion hazard area map looks like. So basically the coastal erosion hazard area is made up of two jurisdictions. The first jurisdiction is the natural protected feature area jurisdiction. And this is delineated on the coastal erosion hazard area map by that solid dark blue line along the coastline. And that identifies where the natural protective features are on the shoreline. So your near shore areas, your beaches, dunes, and bluffs. And we would regulate that area essentially from out in the water and then up to the landward limit of that solid dark line. So if your project falls within that area as identified on the map, you would need a coastal erosion hazard area permit from DEC. The secondary jurisdiction is what we like to call it, is the structural hazard area jurisdiction. And this identifies areas where there's long-term average erosion rates of 1 foot or greater per year. And it's identified on the coastal erosion hazard area map by that darker dash line that runs just landward of the natural protected feature area line. And this area is regulated from the landward limit of the solid line to the landward limit of the dash line. So the area is essentially in between. Structural hazard areas, due to the high erosion rates, certain activities are allowed, but when it comes to new structures, they must be movable and then also set back 25 feet from the natural protective feature area line. And then taking a step back in the natural protective feature area, this area, because the purpose and intent is really to protect our natural features. Most activities are restricted. We do allow for new erosion protection structures, water use structures such as docks, elevated walkways to access water, and so forth. But most, building development is restricted and not allowed within that area. All of the maps can be found at this link on the page. And again, nearly all activities are regulated within this area, within the coastal erosion hazard area. That includes, all soil disturbance activities, even removal of vegetation, the construction of erosion protection structures, any building development, anything like that. You would need to contact DEC prior to conducting work. You'll likely need a permit. Okay, now getting a little bit more in depth on the alternative analysis and our, the requirement for meeting our permit issuance standards. There's really four alternatives that need to be considered. The first is the no action alternative, which I don't have a photo showing, but really considering what would happen at the site, should your project not occur. Is a erosion protection structure truly necessary at the site? If upland development is set pretty far back, is there a need to harden the shoreline immediately? Or can we continue to allow, natural processes to continue for now? If no action isn't an alternative that would work, then, thinking about it almost like a hierarchy, you would then go to your non-structural solutions. So if the idea is that a structure needs to be, if the shoreline needs to be protected to protect an upland structure, could that structure be moved away from areas of active erosion? Or if, wave runoff and flooding is an issue, could that structure be elevated to alleviate the issue? If that is determined not to work at the site, then you can consider natural and nature-based erosion protection alternatives. So these photos show a dune nourishment project and also a beach nourishment project. You could also consider planting like a vegetative buffer along the shoreline, maybe minor regrading and planting, and really limiting the use of, your stone and concrete, and really trying to like mimic the natural features on the shoreline. Okay, and if your no action, non-structural, nature-based solutions are, you feel that they're not gonna provide the level of protection needed, or they're not feasible at the site, that's when you would get into your hard structural erosion protection measures. And when those are needed at a site, we do prefer the use of sloped structures over, vertical structures. So sloped structures such as revetments, they tend to dissipate energy better and cause less impacts to the adjacent areas. Okay, permit application requirements. So I'm essentially going to go through almost like a checklist of what we look for when reviewing a permit application. I'll get into more depth about these when I go through the permit examples, so you can really see what we require for our review. So the first thing you would need to provide that Dave Dink talked about previously is a completed permit application form, whether that be your general permit application or your joint application, which is an individual permit essentially. We would need a location map and aerial photo. That could be either like Google Maps or Bing Maps. So we can get a good idea of where your project is in relation to other shoreline areas, other nearby shoreline structures, and so forth. We would need a stamped and signed survey to give us a pretty good idea of what structures exist at the site, and where the property boundaries are. We would also look for a pretty detailed project description and details on how you meet our permit issuance standards. So we need to understand when we're reviewing a project, why the project is needed at the site, what the issue is, what alternatives you considered, and why. So if you're proposing like a more structural solution, we would need to know why softer and non-structural or even no action alternative wasn't evaluated or considered as part of this project. And then will your project cause a measurable increase in erosion at the proposed site or other locations? So if a structural or even nature-based measure is going to be proposed and constructed, how are you constructing that so it does not cause adverse impacts to the adjacent areas? And then recent photos of the project site, current and past photos are really helpful. We have been, I guess, more recently receiving drone photos, which are also extremely helpful to get a really clear idea of, the site. And then we need a really good description on the construction methods and materials. So when talking about construction methods, we need to know how all the work is going to be taking place, how the materials are going to be placed, and what equipment you're going to be needing, how you're accessing the project. If you're accessing from an adjacent property owner, or if you're going to be accessing from the applicant's property, we would need to know all of that information. And then also the quantity of materials to be used above and below mean high water. And then project plans, which are really, I consider to be one of the most important aspects of an application, to really get a good idea about what's going to be proposed at the site. And we would need a site plan and cross-section plan. For projects, they have multiple aspects to it, such as like if there was a boat ramp to be repaired, and then also an installation of tow stone, we would need a cross-section for each of those activities. If there's going to be any plantings done as part of the project, we would need a pretty detailed planting plan that describes the types of plant species to be planted and how they're going to be maintained. And then for structural erosion protection solutions, we would need a long-term maintenance plan that really identifies, how often you're going to be inspecting your structure, how, what you're actually going to be inspecting for as far as deficiencies, and then how those repairs are going to be conducted to ensure your structure provides long-term protection. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a permit application example that shows the level of detail that we really need to see when submitting an application. So the site that was selected for this example is a site in the town of Richland in Oswego County. It's an area on a bluff. There's bluff feature, and then there's also a beach. And there is an existing concrete break wall that has been destroyed over the years, but still sits on the beach. Besides that concrete wall, the remaining area on that property is not protected. So we would need, the location map, an aerial photo, and then a property survey. And again, the location map can be either a Google or Bing map, identifying where the project is. Okay, so for this project specifically, a drone photo was provided, and it really clarified, what the existing site conditions were. So there is an existing 3-foot high concrete wall that will be replaced with an 11-foot high stone revetment. The remaining top of bluff will be graded and planted with vegetation. The stone revetment will sit slightly closer to the bottom of bluff than the existing concrete wall, and all new material will be placed above mean high water. So this project description gives a pretty clear understanding of what the existing conditions were and what the proposed structure will be. It'll be an 11-foot high stone revetment, and then above that will be graded and planted with vegetation. And then it also gives a really good description about where the new structure will be placed as it relates to the existing concrete wall and mean high water. And, for all new structures, we do look to minimize lakeward encroachment to the greatest extent possible. So clearly stating this is very helpful for our review. Okay, now getting into permit issuance standards, which would be a written description as part of the permit application. So your justification, the property has an existing concrete wall that has been overtopped and undermined due to high water and wave action. Prior to 2017, there was 28 feet of land between the house and edge of bluff. The high water has caused substantial erosion and has put the house at risk. The bluff is now near vertical and there is only 14 feet of land between the house and top edge of bluff. The stone revetment is needed to protect the house from damages caused by erosion. So the justification here is that there is a house at risk. Describing the erosion rates at the property is very helpful for us. Understanding the extent of the issue, provides justification for a project. And then essentially, describing how those damages were caused to the site is also helpful. So for this one specifically, that existing concrete wall was overtopped and undermined by the high water. Okay, and then getting into alternatives. Due to the limited space on the lot and the increased erosion rates, moving the structure landward was not considered a viable alternative. Nature-based solutions that were evaluated included bluff planting, slope grading, and a single row of toe stone. These alternatives were evaluated, but given the current lake level and recent storm events, these alternatives alone would likely not last long-term. Given the proximity of the house to the eroding edge and the amount of erosion that occurred, a stone revetment along the bottom of bluff with vegetation planted above the stone is the preferred alternative. So this gives a really good description of the alternatives that were evaluated, why they weren't chosen as the preferred alternative, and sort of the analysis behind how they got to a stone revetment. A lot of times we receive applications where it just says, a stone revetment is proposed at the site, and there is not enough background information or discussion on alternatives that were considered for us to understand if the project does meet our permit issuance standards. So for all projects, especially new erosion protection projects, we need good justification and good alternatives analysis. And then lastly, adverse impacts. The property to the south has an existing stone revetment that the proposed revetment will tie into. The property to the north has an unprotected natural shoreline. The revetment will only be placed immediately in front of the house and will not extend to the north property boundary to minimize adverse effects to the north adjacent shoreline. The north end section will be sloped into the bluff to further minimize adverse impacts. Okay, and then stepping back here just so you can see the photo. The stone to the right is to the south. So they're basically stating that the revetment will tie into this existing structure to the south. And then as they move to the north, they will not go all the way to the property boundary where no existing shoreline structure exists to help minimize adverse effects to that adjacent property. Further, that end section will be gradually tied into the shoreline and essentially, not created in a perpendicular manner. So perpendicular end sections typically will cause an increase in erosion due to end flanking and, the wave impact in the corner of the structure. So making sure structures, gradually sloped at the ends is very important. Okay, and these are the site photos. It's very helpful if the site photos are labeled. So, starting on the left side, this shows the shoreline looking to the south. So you can see where that existing revetment is. The center photo is also looking to the south, but, showing more of the upper bluff area and that existing structure. And then the last photo is looking to the north. And you can see an adjacent property further down, but basically that whole shoreline immediately next to this property is unprotected. Okay, and then getting into construction methods and materials. The contractor will access the project area from the applicant's property. The contractor will track an excavator down the bluff slope and will conduct work from the beach. First, the existing concrete will be broken into small sections and removed from the shoreline. All concrete debris will be disposed of in an improved upland location. Next, geotextile fabric will be placed on the eroding edge, and then the toe stone will be keyed in. The setting stone and armor stone will be installed working from the bottom to the top of the slope. The large stone and armor stone will be individually placed by the excavator and not dumped down the bluff slope. So this gives a pretty good description on how the structure is actually going to be constructed and how they're going to be accessing the project. And then further, the individual toe stone size will be 3 to 4 tons, and the individual armor stone size will be 2 to 3 ton. Stone will be irregular in shape, and the largest stones will be placed on the surface. The armor stone layer will be a minimum of 36 inches thick. The setting stone will be a mix of size ranging from 100 to 500 pounds each. The setting stone layer will be a minimum of 1 to 1.5 foot thick. So this description here details the types of materials to be used and the individual stone size. We do need the individual stone size to be identified to determine if it meets our recommendations for stone size. There are calculations that can be conducted to determine adequate stone size, but this size stone is pretty commonly used. So if we saw that only 1,000-pound stone would be used for toe stone, that would we would recommend that larger stone be used in that circumstance. Okay, and then once the stonework is complete, topsoil will be installed above the armor stone and seeded with native steep slope mix. So it basically describes start to finish how the work's going to be completed, what the materials are, and how that work's going to be conducted. Okay, so this shows what a site plan would look like and the level of detail required. So all of the labels that have the yellow shading on it identify what the existing conditions are at the site. And then all of the blue show what the proposed conditions are. So we need a really good understanding of, how the proposed project is and where it's going to be in comparison to your existing conditions. So we have the property boundaries, which we need in order to issue a permit. We need to ensure that work is going to be taking place on the applicant's property. For this one specifically, you can see this proposed stone here will encroach slightly onto that southern property. In these circumstances, if it's only 1 or 2 feet, we would likely just require written consent from that adjacent property owner that states they're allowing you to conduct that work. If it's, substantial encroachment, then we would likely require that the adjacent property owner submit a separate permit application. Okay, and then the site plan identifies where the construction access route is going to be. It identifies where your toe stone layer is going to be and where all the armor stone is going to be placed in relation to the existing eroding edge. It also identifies where the existing house is in relation to that eroding edge, and offsets are provided. Most often we need at least 2 offsets to be provided from the existing structure to the proposed activity. And then, this plan specifically identifies existing trees that need to be removed. Let's see here. And then, the existing concrete blocks to be removed on the shoreline. So really all your existing and proposed conditions should be outlined on the plan. And then another important factor to determine, other permits that may be required or reviewed by other agencies is the location of your mean high water level. Note that this elevation here is for Lake Ontario. It's not Lake Erie elevation. But you would identify the mean high water elevation on Lake Erie on your plan and where that is in relation to your project. Okay, and then getting into the cross-section plan, we need to see, again, all the existing conditions, which are identified here in yellow. So you can see where the existing house is, where your top edge of bluff is, the existing slope. So this dash line that moves through here identifies where the existing bluff slope is and identifies where the existing concrete block is and where that mean high water elevation is in relation to that. And then for the proposed structure, it identifies where the setting stone is going to be, the geotextile fabric placed underneath, your armor stone layer and your toe stone layer. And then, basically the slope of your structure as well as the height and width of the structure. This project specifically provided elevations, but you don't necessarily need to provide that. You can just state that it's going to be, 6 or 10 feet high. And then getting into the vegetation, if that is proposed, identifying where that's going to be, and if any additional materials are needed to plant that vegetation, such as topsoil or any other, type of stabilization blankets, that would need to be identified on the project plan. Okay, and then for the plants, again, we do require a planting plan. So for this one, it says the bluff above the armor stone will be seeded with a native steep slope mix. The plantings will be maintained by watering and weeding to ensure they become well established. Planting areas that do not survive will be revegetated until they become well established. So as part of the planting plan, we would require the specific seed mix of what you're going to be planting. We need to ensure that they are all native to New York, and also that they are, mixes that would do well on the coastline. We want to ensure that what you're planting will become well established. Okay, and then for the long-term maintenance plan, that again, it's required for any erosion protection structure, the construction, modification, or restoration of an erosion protection structure requires a new long-term maintenance plan. So for this one specifically, the permittee shall periodically inspect the revetment at least once per month and after large storms. Inspections should look for evidence of moved or slipped material, flanking, scour, exposed fabric, or drainage issues. If stones have shifted, the permittee shall contact the engineer and contractor to provide required repairs. The DEC shall be contacted prior to making repairs. So it identifies how often, the project is going to be inspected, what deficiencies are going to be inspected, and what, should there be any damages, how those repairs are going to be made. And contacting DEC prior to making repairs is always recommended. There are, certain normal maintenance activities where you may not need a permit, but when working, anywhere below mean high water, or, oftentimes repairs are much more extensive than normal maintenance. So we would need to, reissue a permit at that point. So please contact us prior to making any repairs, just so we can see exactly, what you need in order to move forward with the repairs. Okay, and then once you submit a permit application, and we conduct our review, there is most often additional information that's required on the project plans, or, as far as the alternative analysis and justification for the project. It really is uncommon to receive an application that is 100% complete. However, I would just stress, do your best, provide as much application or project information as you can. It really does help with our review and limits the amount of comments that we have, following our review. So you may receive a notice of incomplete application, and this is what one would look like, and our comments would be listed out. And then, once you would receive the incomplete application, you would provide those updates and we would review again. And if all of the comments were satisfied, then that's when we would go ahead and issue the permit. And basically a permit is issued when all of our permit issuance standards are met and when all the requested information is submitted. And the permit cover, it may look slightly different for a general permit, but it will be very clear that it is an actual permit. And essentially you need to waive for a permit before starting any activities. And here's my contact information. And I will turn it over to, I believe, the Army Corps of Engineers.
Well, first, what we're gonna do, we're gonna take one question, and then we're gonna transition to Department of State first. But Beth, did the example from Oswego County evaluate moving the house? Loss of 14 feet over 5 years seems to suggest that there could likely be continued adverse impacts over the next 5 years. Was upland erosion ruled out? This would be a great project to monitor post-installation to evaluate performance, bluff protection, and adjacent erosion at unprotected areas. I do want to say one comment quickly about the upland erosion here. Here, this was like very much lake wave erosion, high water stuff. So I've been out to the area, and it's the upland erosion probably wasn't an issue there. Oh.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the site there, which I can go back to that drone photo. So I don't know if you can see it, but this here, that's the access road, which is like an individual private road to access the property. So it's a very limited space on that particular parcel. And there really wasn't any room to move the structure back. There are a lot of site constraints there. So essentially moving the structure would require them to pick a new parcel somewhere else. It wouldn't be at the site. And then when it comes to the erosion damages, as Roy kind of mentioned, this bluff was pretty well sloped and stable, but because of the high water, the toe had eroded pretty significantly and caused it to be essentially vertical. So at that point, it's a revetment, would have been needed to prevent further recession of that bluff and to protect that dwelling.
Great, thank you to Beth and to David. So are we gonna go to Matt or are we gonna go to Peter here? Either way, just share your screen and we'll move on.
Hi, folks, this is Matt Maraglio. I'm with the Department of State. I'm here with my colleague, Peter Bazan. Peter, you want to wave hello?
Hi.
All right. Roy, am I in presentation mode here?
Yes, you are.
All right, so we're going to go over federal consistency review here today. As I said, I'm Matt Maraglio. I'm with the Department of State's Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure, and I'm the Division Director for the Development Division. And Peter is a colleague of mine that focuses on federal consistency review. So back in 1972, the Coastal Zone Management Act was passed by this guy here. It was part of a much larger package of an environmental agenda that was occurring back then. Think Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, things of that nature. So it was truly a watershed moment in the environmental movement. The Coastal Zone Management Act started out as a nationwide attempt at zoning, and because people love zoning so much, it's failed spectacularly. So what it did end up doing was controlling development in the United States in the area where most people in the United States lived back then, and that was along the coast. So federal consistency review at its heart is a control of federal actions. So federal actions, whether they're permitting, funding, or direct actions, and we're going to focus on permitting today, that occur in or will affect a state's coastal zone must be consistent, and that's a term of regulation, with the enforceable policies of the state's coastal management program. Now, there's 37 different coastal management programs in the United States. They're all different. They all say different things, but the intent of them is to manage their coast and utilize a state's control of federal actions as a mechanism to do that. So we talked about those types of activities, but essentially, again, certain federal actions cannot be undertaken without being found consistent with the state's enforceable coastal policies. Now, they fall into a bunch of categories. There's direct actions. So an example of that is the Army Corps of Engineers conducting a dredging operation. They can be authoritative. We'll use the Army Corps of Engineers again, but them issuing a permit. Could be funding to a state or local government. So that's like HUD providing funding to a municipality. And where we're getting more and more of these days, but it's not going to apply here, is outer continental shelf plans. So know that we do regulate offshore wind development out in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, New York State uses federal consistency review as one means of implementing its coastal management program. There's lots of different laws that are part and parcel of the coastal management program, and federal consistency review is one tool that we use. You've heard from Beth and Dave about DEC's regulatory programs. They are other tools that New York State uses to implement its goals. So federal consistency review is a policy-based approach, and it applies state policies to federal actions. Now, those reviews are based on effects, not location. So the location of an activity is irrelevant. If it's going to affect the New York State's coastal uses and resources, then that activity is potentially subject to federal consistency review. There's no categorical limitations. And the act itself encourages state and federal coordination and cooperation. So you see us working in partnership with our federal partners on almost all of the activities that we review. The goals are to bring agencies to the table early on in the process and to avoid any costly last minute type changes. So we try to get ourselves involved early and figure out options. And there's also incentive here to build state and public support for federal actions as well, the ones that are beneficial. So New York State decided to develop its own coastal management program. The Coastal Zone Management Act allows for states to develop their coastal management plan, and they incentivize it by providing funding and this federal consistency authority. It took New York 10 years to adopt its program. So from 1972 to 1982, New York State was working diligently to develop its own coastal management plan. It required several new laws, one of which you've already heard already. That's the Coastal Erosion Hazard Area Act and Article 42 of the New York State Executive Law. Our program is a networked coastal management program. So what that means is we take multiple sets of state laws, policies, and regulations and join them into one cohesive document. Many other states take a different approach where they have a centralized coastal management program, and their federal consistency review authority is housed within their equivalent of the Department of Environmental Conservation and their equivalent of the Environmental Conservation Law. It's about a 70-30% ratio of how states handle it. Our coastal management program, while not unique, is rare in that it incorporates special management areas. And we'll go into what some of those special management areas are in a moment.
Okay.
Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah. All right. So where's the coastal zone? The coastal zone is demonstrated in this map with the yellow line. So it's all throughout the state. So it's encompassing Long Island, the Hudson River up until the Troy Dam, St. Lawrence, Lake Ontario, Niagara River, in Lake Erie. So it's all throughout the state. And if you're proposing a project anywhere in this location, this is where you'd have to come into the Department of State. And the coastal line varies inland roughly 1,000 feet from place to place, but it's different throughout the area. Okay, next. So this is what some of the potential federal actions that would require consistency review. So it could be direct actions to financial, or it could be other means, but mostly the federal permitting action is what we'll be looking at today for this presentation. So the application for a federal permit on the list must certify that they will conduct the activity in a manner that's fully consistent with all of the 44 policies, unless they're located within a local waterfront revitalization program, which the local community will have a more specific sub-policy potentially for that project. And there is no balancing with these policies, so one policy is not more important than the other. So all of the policies have to be met and found consistent for the particular project that we have. The Department of State has a 6-month review period to complete our review of the project application. Now that can be delayed a little bit if more needed time is needed for the applicant to submit additional information to the state, and we can enter into a stay agreement, which would basically pause the clock and allow the applicant to provide that information to us. And if a project isn't found consistent through the Department of State's, an objection would be issued. And if an objection is issued, the federal agency cannot authorize the activity. Okay. So this is what all the criteria that we need for a complete application. And Beth did an excellent job going through this and identifying some of the things that we need. So basically all the information that the DEC or Army Corps would require, we also would need to see that as part of our application for a complete application. It's always just a good idea that everything that you're sending to the other agencies also send to us, including the joint application, detailed description, site maps, both side view and above view with the mean high water line shown on those plans. In addition, we also request that we have our Federal Consistency Assessment Form, or FCAF, which is a 3-page document that we have. It's separate from all the other agencies. So here's what the FCAF looks like. It's just 3 pages. The first page is just indicating the contact for the project, a brief description, location of the project. And then the second page is showing all the potential activities that project has. For most of them, you'll probably check no for most of your general permit applications, but every now and then there will be a yes there. And it's a little hard to see in this picture, but with each of those activities, there is a policy number that's associated with that action. And if you mark yes for that, an additional piece of paper, we ask that you please provide a policy analysis indicating how your project is consistent with that policy. And it's also very important to make sure the third page is signed and dated, and that would be part of the application that we need to have a full application to proceed with our review. So once an application is submitted to the Department of State, it'll be 30 days before we can look at it to determine if it has all necessary information. And if within that first 30 days, we might be sending a request for necessary information to complete the full application package, so we can have a full package and begin our review period. If not, we potentially request an NDI for necessary information or an ADI for additional information. And there's a few courses of actions that we could follow. General concurrence, where our GC review is a little quicker review, and that would be a potential if we have all the information and can proceed and fit that criteria. If it's a new project, we would probably request that we need to do a public notice, which could take up to 45 days from when we issue it, but it's the 30-day review for the public to issue comments on a particular project. And then if we do receive any comments from the public, we have to review those comments and see how they fit with the actual project itself. Or we could issue a consistency determination. And I'll go into this a little bit later on the next slide, I think. So the general concurrence is one of the options that we could have. It's one that we issue often, and it's abbreviated review. Mostly this concurs is if the project is in place replacement or it's maintenance of an existing structure. And this doesn't require a public notice. It could also potentially fall under a nationwide permit or a regional permit, which the Department of State has concurred with the criteria for it. And usually in the Buffalo Army Corps district, we try to have our projects fall under the regional permit. So it meets all the criteria that the Army Corps has determined is consistent with their views of a new project. There's also the Lake Erie, Great Lakes Erosion Control General Permit, which was issued and talked about before. So if it doesn't meet the GC, it would potentially be into a concurrence. This does require a public notice for a 30-day period. And this is usually if a new structure is being submitted or a substantial modification to existing structure is being submitted to an application. And if that applicant, we could issue a general consistency determination, which is asking for a change to their proposal. And if that happens and the consultant does not concur with those changes, it's potential that we would go to an objection. And if an objection is issued, the federal agency's application permit is not valid. And Matt will talk about that a little more on the next slide.
All right, so as Peter mentioned, if we have an objection to somebody's project, while I'd like to think that I'm perfect, the federal government does not necessarily think so all the time. So there is an appeals process. So in essence, if we say no, which we work very hard to not do, I think in the history of the entire program, the 40 years of our program, we've had maybe 40 objections. But in the unlikely event that we can't come to some terms and we object and you decide to appeal our decision, your appeal mechanism is to the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce, in order to override our objection, needs to find one of two things: that the project is consistent with the objectives or purposes of the Coastal Zone Management Act, or that the project is necessary in the interest of national security. I'll touch on the necessary in the interest of national security grounds first. That is a very high bar to meet. It's happened once in the history of the Coastal Zone Management Act. Consistent with the objectives or purposes of the Coastal Zone Management Act is a little easier to reach, but the Secretary of Commerce would have to meet those three sub-bullets in order to override our decision. Significantly and substantially furthers the national interest. The project's interests outweigh adverse coastal effects. And 3, there's no reasonable alternatives to the project. That last bullet is why we make every effort to exhaust any reasonable alternatives to the project, because if there are any reasonable alternatives, the Secretary of Commerce cannot override our objection. Now we'll go into coastal policies a little bit, like you heard Peter talking about and mentioning before. Think of the coastal policies as buckets for various state laws and regulations. So similar state laws and regulations fit into these broad policy categories: development, flooding and erosion, public access, history and scenic resources, energy and ice management, wetlands, fish and wildlife, general, recreation, agriculture, water and air resources. There are 44 policies in total. Unless there is a local waterfront revitalization program in your specific municipality that you're working in, and that LWRP may have more or less depending on the makeup of that LWRP. Once we're undertaking a full review, whereby we're planning on issuing a concurrence or an objection, we're evaluating your project and its consistency with each one of these policies. And as Peter mentioned before, your project has to be consistent with every single one of the policies, or that policy be not applicable. As I said before, all the policies are enforceable by New York State law or regulation. However, it's not a parts per million type decision. It's a policy-based decision, not a standards-based decision. Each policy has several paragraphs of guidance language, which discusses how we tend to interpret that policy. However, that guidance language is purely advisory. It does not control our review. It's the bolded language inside the document, which we and our federal partners at NOAA, who evaluate our program and are in charge of reviewing appeals, let's look at. It's that bolded language. And finally, if we do object to your project, it can't just be because we don't like it, right? It has to be a specific policy out of the 44, one or more of the 44 that are that the project is inconsistent with. All right, now Peter's going to go into special management areas.
Okay. So one of the location of special management areas that we have to look at when we're reviewing a project is whether it's located in a local waterfront revitalization program, or LWRP. And these are set up by the municipality, either a town or a village, and it will be either the entire town village line or a section of that village line. And they can complete a community-wide local consistency review, and they'll have specific sub-policies to our 44 policies, indicating a special area for that area, and if there's anything specific that needs to be protected in that area. Here's just an example of what we look at when you're identifying a project, whether it's in an LWRP or not. Here's just the village and town of Clayton, also Cape Vincent and Dexter and Sackett's Harbor. And this is just showing that if your project is located within one of these orange areas, local LWRP policies need to be met and identified. And it's also, when we're reviewing a project, we contact the LWRP to determine if they found the project consistent or not. So we also are working hand in hand with the town or village on a project.
And why these local waterfront revitalization program areas are so important is that it gives municipalities the ability to affect federal decisioning. So these municipalities, and there's multiple ones throughout the state, have made the affirmative choice that they want to have some type of effect over federal processes in their municipality. And it's one of the few ways where local communities can really affect federal decisioning.
There's also the significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats, and these are located again throughout the state. And these are areas designated by the Department of State upon recommendations from the DEC for specific characteristics. And these are habitat improvement projects that we want to make sure that all the habitats for these local areas are kept, upheld, and protected throughout the state. The whole habitat is considered, not just an individual species. And policy 7 of the 44 is part of the process for all significant fish and wildlife habitats. And on the next slide, I'll just show an indication of where these are located. They're all throughout the area. Now, this is up in the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario, but these green spots are indicating where all these local significant fish and wildlife habitats can be found. And there's also the scenic areas of statewide significance, or SAS. These are indicating and protecting the visibility of a local area, but they're only located in the Hudson Valley or East Hampton, so they wouldn't be any place out in the Great Lakes at this moment. Here's just a nice resource of where you can find all the local areas, if it's whether it's in an LWRP or a significant fish and wildlife habitat, or in a SAS. You can visit the Gateway information link located right here. We can share this at the end of the presentation if needed. And so it'll show you your spot and whether you need to identify that spot or not. Here's just some other useful links that we would need for our application, or if you're submitting to us. The FCAF is the first link. There would be that 3-page document that we need specifically for Department of State review, along with all the other information. It also has the coastal management program policies. So if you do check yes to one of those policies that you're potentially be affected, that link will show you where those policies are and how you need to make sure they are concurrent with those policies.
And just to point out here, we will accept your application materials by email. And that last line shows the email address you should be sending materials to if you choose to submit by email. All right, and there's our contact information. And with that, if there's no questions, we will pass it on to Steve, I believe. Actually, I do see 2 questions in the chat. Roy?
So, well, I only see one, and that was a comment from me that was a
Oh,
link
gotcha.
to the DOS gateway. A lot of information there, so I definitely recommend that for finding out where you are on the shoreline and such.
Great, appreciate that.
Other than that, I think we are good to pass it on over to Stephen Mativier from United States Army Corps of Engineers.
All righty. Good morning, everybody. I'll try and be quick so we can do some Q&A at the end. Let me share my screen here. And hopefully everybody can see that presentation at this point.
Good to go.
All righty. So I'm Steve Mativier. I'm Chief of the Regulatory Branch for the Army Corps of Engineers Buffalo District. We have kind of the whole coastline in Buffalo District from Lake Erie all the way up Lake Ontario and into the St. Lawrence River for regulatory purposes. So where do we live? We've got 2 laws that we play with. The one is Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, oldest environmental law on the books in the United States, probably worldwide, except for maybe some really old ones like the Magna Carta, but that's a long time ago. And that has to do with big waters like Lake Erie is where we're talking about today. So a lot of Section 10 stuff today. And the other one is Section 404, the Clean Water Act, 1972, significantly newer, but still around for a while now. And that's in bigger, you know, it's kind of all waters in the United States, just not just the big ones. It does apply into the big ones, but also the little ones. And so kind of regulated some different things. Under Section 10, we require permits for any work in, over, or under a navigable water. Again, let's look at Lake Erie, pieces of Cattaraugus Creek down there, the Buffalo River, in that part of the world is Section 10. And then so any permit, any structure, dredging work in above or below, that'd be dredging, that'd be open pile docks, any kind of structural thing that you're doing there that's in the water. And we'll get to that next slide. Section 404 applies to all waters of the United States. So that would be the big waters and little waters and wetlands, those kinds of things. But it regulates much narrower band of activities. The activities that are regulated is discharge of dredged or fill material. So what's a dredged or fill material? Well, in where we're talking about today, riprap, armor stone, any kind of fill material along the shoreline for bank stabilization, that'd be Section 404. And if you're building a crib dock, for example, and you're filling those cribs with rocks, that'd be a fill under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So a couple of different laws that have some overlap in big waters like this. So our jurisdiction lives, and we'll be over here because I'm not going to talk about tidal waters, but we live in fresh waters here, and we live for the big waters. And again, we'll talk to Lake Erie here. We live from the ordinary high water mark waterward. So ordinary high water is where the water gets to on a kind of an annual or reasonable time every other year. Effectively is ordinary high water, and you can see it on the bank. If you got a bulkhead in the water, you'll be able to see that line on the bulkhead, and that's pretty close to ordinary high water. And then Section 404 goes beyond this ordinary high water up the shoreline. If we're talking about wetlands or another stream, we would get shoreline. But if there's no wetlands, we stop at ordinary high water, and where that is. Lake Erie is 573.4 International Great Lakes datum 1985. That's a datum that's that was calculated, and every 30 years it's supposed to go undergo a reevaluation. And those of you that can do math in your head, you're saying, wait a minute, 30 years from 1985 is before now. And the answer is we're working on a new IGLD, and it should come out. It'll be IGLD 2020, and it should come out in the next couple of years. So so that's coming. So Lake Erie 573.4 IGLD 1985, Lake Ontario 247.3 IGLD 1985. And I believe those elevations for Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are consistent with ordinary high water and mean high water for state purposes. So those are numbers you want to know. And if you're a surveyor, you know there's a difference between IGLD and NVGD, which is the kind of different datum that people use. And the IGLD is the one that we use at the Corps of Engineers. So what happens if you're doing bank stabilization and you're above 573.4 IGLD and there's no wetlands? I tell you to have a very nice day. I pat you on the head, off you go. And you're on your way. You could still absolutely need a permit from DEC for their coastal zone stuff, as Beth was talking about. But for us, if you're not waterward of that ordinary high water, have a nice day. And we don't regulate that. So what kind of things do we regulate in this part of the world? And we're going to stay along the shoreline because that's what we're doing today. Things like docks, decks, boathouses, stone riprap revetments, bioengineered protective structures, breakwalls, jetties, seawalls, dredging, all those kinds of things are things that show up as things that need permits from the Corps of Engineers. So we have some different kinds of permits that we play with. There's two kinds: individual and general. And you want to stay over here as much as you can in the general permits area. Individual permits, if the project is what it is, then we deal with individual permits, but general permits are where we want to go, and we'll get to that in a minute. So under individual permits, there's two kinds. First is the standard individual permit. This is the one that they wrote in the regs back in 1977 when they first started with the Clean Water Act and the Corps 404 stuff. It was also part of, before that was Section 10. We would do a standard individual permit. This is what they wrote up, and it's public notice. It's a 30-day, 15 or 30-day public notice. We coordinate with involved agencies, interested parties. There's a general public component. We do a full public interest review, and it takes some time, 120 days from the receipt of complete application. I think you heard from the other agencies that often we don't get an actual complete application the first time around, and that's okay. You know, we do the best we can, but 120 days from the time we get a complete application. And I'll be honest with you, if it's a big individual permit, we may not hit that 120 days. We'd like to, but we may not. So things, what would this look like? What would the standard individual permit look like? So this would be a new marina. You know, you've got a piece of shoreline that doesn't have anything on it right now, and you want to build a 300 boat marina. That's probably going to be a standard individual permit. That's big enough that where you're going to be putting that many docks in the water. You'll probably do some shoreline work. So that would be a public notice. You're doing perhaps an enormous revetment, stone revetment, that might live in a standard individual permit. And you know, and we'd probably ask you, why does that have to be so huge? And sometimes they do, and that's where it is. I mean, sometimes on the big waters you need big stuff. But those are the kinds of things that wind up in the standard individual permit. And really, you don't want to be there if you don't have to be, because it just takes time, and there's a lot of information required for us and for the public and everything else. So that takes some time. The second kind of individual permits. This is kind of a smaller thing. It's called a letter of permission. We use these on a case-by-case basis. Some rules here: minor individual or cumulative impacts on the environment or navigation, no appreciable opposition. So what does no appreciable opposition mean? Does that mean if my neighbor doesn't want me to do it and they and they're upset, that's appreciable opposition? Probably a single neighbor saying, no, we don't like this, is not appreciable opposition. However, we get, 15, 20 or 30 people saying, hey, you shouldn't do this because of X, Y, and Z. Well, then maybe that tips the scales, and we're going from a letter of permission back to this standard individual permit. So we use abbreviated coordination and documentation. 15-day coordination. We coordinate that with resource agencies, DEC, Department of State, sometimes Coast Guard, adjacent property owners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Normally we don't get a ton of feedback from those. And so we use those for minor Section 10 activities. This is kind of the big one: docks, maintenance, dredging, those kinds of things that are out there. And then we can also use them for some 404 activities, this discharge of dredge or fill material. So sometimes when you're dredging, the material is sand, and it really should stay in the lake. It should stay in the lake system. And so so we can authorize that if you're dredging, because you got a marina that's filled in with sand, we want that sand to go back in the near shore area. So we authorize both of those activities under a letter of permission. And we also have, there's open lake disposal areas that we have people use sometimes, and so we can do, again, maintenance dredging if it's finer material and it's not really sand, not appropriate for near shore. Sometimes we can use the open lake disposal areas. So those are things that we can authorize under a letter of permission. Again, the target processing time is 120 days from a complete application. Much more likely, much more likely we're going to hit that with a letter of permission than we will with a standard permit. So those are the individual permits that we've got. General permits. So these are cool, and this is where you want to be. They're for established categories of activities. A lot less time to talk about, to get through. 60 days from complete application, and some don't even require notification to the Corps. And how cool is that? That's kind of the best of all worlds, isn't it? And so some things about this: they have to be specific, minimal individual, cumulative, or environmental impacts. So that's an important thing about general permits. There's three kinds of general permits. First kind, so we've got regional permits, nationwide permits, and programmatic general permits. So regional permits are issued by the district. Our district commander will issue them, and I'll go through a couple of examples for our part of the world. And think of general permits as a box. We create this box, and anything that fits in the box is authorized. We're authorizing the box, and all you're doing is using that box when you're going. So we can have boxes created on a regional level or on a nationwide level. This happens every 5 years. We issue nationwide permits, or it can be issued kind of in general in partnership with the state. We're currently working on one with New York State DEC, where the DEC and the Corps could kind of authorize, say it's okay for the same thing, kind of a one-stop shop. Not going to talk too much about that one right now. We'll see that as it comes by. But I did want to talk about the nationwide permits. I should have gone. Let's go the other way. Let's go regional first. So Matt and Peter were just talking about regional permits, and that we like to keep some of those things within the regional permits. And a lot of that is docks and decks and such. And we've got these two for, and these are just examples. We have a couple others, but these are the ones that we use a lot. Open pile docks, no more than 100 feet waterward, no more than 150 feet total length. So you can have different configurations. It can look like an F, it can look like an L, look like an E, but no more than 150 feet total length. I didn't put it down, but I believe it's 6 feet wide, maybe 8 feet wide for the deck. The dock itself. The deck can be no more than 240 square feet. So that's kind of any kind of big square or rectangle or whatever kind of shape you want to make it, that can be included, but the deck itself can be no more than 240 square feet as we go along. So some important things that we use for regional permits. One is this at least got to be 10 feet from the property line. Why do we do that? We do that because I've been at the Corps almost 29 years, and the very worst and hardest things we wind up with is dock wars. And dock wars are when one neighbor doesn't like the other neighbor, and I've seen all sorts of crazy things trying to be done with docks being built here, there, and everywhere. And we try and avoid that by keeping everything 10 feet from the property line. There's no rule in Section 10 or Section 404 that's got to be that way, but it certainly helps a lot as we move through. Can't be constructed parallel to the shoreline without a variance from this. Some for this one need individual consistency concurrence from New York State Department of State. And so that's one of those things. In certain areas, you'll need to do consistency concurrence from Department of State. Regional permit for timber crib docks. Now this has got a fill associated. So this one is section 10 only, regional permit 87, 86 is 10 and 404. So same length and width kind of stuff. Cribs have to be open face. The water has to be able to actually interface with the rocks inside. Length of cribs cannot be more than 50% of the dock length, so we can have water circulation back and forth. Needs an individual water quality cert from Department of Environmental Conservation. We'll talk about that in a minute. And some will need individual concurrence from New York State Department of State. So where's my nationwide permits? There we go. So nationwide permits, that's the second one on the list. And these are issued every 5 years at headquarters level, and they're very specific for activities. For example, nationwide 3, oops, come back. Nationwide 3 for repair or rehabilitate of existing currently serviceable structures or fills. Minor deviations are allowed. You can repair it if it was damaged as a result of a discrete event, a flood, storm, something like that. Nationwide 13 is bank stabilization for erosion control, and anything less than or equal to, it shouldn't say greater than equal, it should be less than or 500 linear feet and 1 cubic yard of material per running foot of bank. And no work in wetlands, again, that can be waived, but in general, we don't want to have that. In general, if you're working in wetlands, you probably don't need bank stabilization. And then nationwide 19 was little tiny dredging of no more than 25 cubic yards of material and no work in wetlands. So these are kind of examples of what the nationwides are. We have 56 of them, I think, at this point, but the ones you're going to run into on the lake are pretty much these. And we nested these 313 and 19 with the state GP that Dave Dang talked about earlier on, and for a lot of your shoreline work, this is where you want to live. If you can possibly make it happen, this is where you want to live. Is this DEC GP? Because as Dave said, most of the time you don't need to even talk to us at the Corps of Engineers, and Department of State has concurred with their consistency on some of those things. But there are some exceptions for that, and I'll drag you all the way down to F here, because the first ones are have to do with endangered species, and all for Lake Ontario, Oswego County, and Cayuga County, and those were up in the Thousand Islands. So we're talking about Lake Erie today, so we'll just skip those. We'll get to F, which is projects that involve placement of stone below mean high water in excess of an average of 1 cubic yard per running foot of shoreline. Those you need to come to us. You need to send an application in, even if it looks like it might be authorized under the GP. So that's kind of the big one. And for that one, you also have to send it to Department of State for their concurrence. But most of the time that you want to live under this one, and most of the time I think you're going to be able to. You know, where you're not going to be able to do those are those new revetments, new structures, those kinds of things, as Beth was talking about. So things that have to happen with the federal government. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be quick here. We didn't get a chance to talk about, Dave didn't get a chance to talk about Section 4.1 water quality certification. This is kind of a trump card by the state, much like the Coastal Zone Consistency Program is a trump card by the state. New York State DEC has to issue water quality certification for any activity involving discharge into waters. And so that's, you know, in this particular case, it could be issued by the state, or if you're working on the Seneca Nation, it'd be issued by the Seneca Nation or the St. Regis Mohawk up in Franklin County. I don't think anybody here is doing that, but that's it's a 1-year time limit to get to. Usually takes a lot less time than that, and then after it's issued, it requires a 30-day coordination with the US EPA for potential impacts to neighboring jurisdictions. Now, I could spend all day talking about 401. The key is you know, if you need it, you need to be talking to New York State DEC pretty early on. And how do I know I need it? Is if it's not one of these, and you're in the coastal erosion hazard area, need a water quality cert. Coastal consistency, I don't need to do that. Matt and Peter did a great job with that. So some required information we need, and Beth did a fabulous job walking through some of these things. So applicant impact. So important things I'm just going to point out. Total area of impact, square feet of acres below OHW. Very important to have that. Total volume of dredged or fill material. Going to dredge 1,500 cubic yards. Say I'm going to dredge 1,500 cubic yards. Sign the application. We get a bunch that aren't signed all the time. So you, if you're a contractor, you're signing, but also the applicant is signing that one as well. So make sure your joint application is signed. General location map, plan view, cross section. I've got a couple of examples I'm going to breeze right through because again, Beth had better ones than I do. We now submit those things via email to us. Here's the email address where you want to submit that, and here's our website for kind of general information on core stuff. Some sample drawings. Beth had a much better one than this. So bank stabilization. So things that we need to have. Again, kind of this is a cross section. You know, if you're going to grade the bank, what is it going to look like? Distance above OHW. So where does the Corps regulate? We regulate this little piece. We kind of anything that's waterward of where this line is. This OHW gets to the shoreline, and so anything above that, you know, we're out. We're out. DEC can be in. Anything below that, and we are in. Again, another kind of more engineered drawing. You know, they don't have to be engineered, but they should be legible, and you should be able to know, you know, kind of the width of the fill, the depth of the fill from OHW. What are you looking at? So and really, when I'm talking about how many cubic yards are below OHW, that's what I'm looking at. Is this kind of this quadrilateral, as if it were, below OHW. This part up here is interesting, but we don't regulate it. We only regulate what's below OHW. Other things, sample drawings. If you've got a dock, look at, you know, here's an area to be dredged. The dock, where's the property lines, distance from the property lines, and then cross section for that. If you're dredging, what's the new bottom depth? I need an elevation in the bottom, existing elevation, proposed elevation, kind of a cross section. So, and then where you're going to put it. So those are things. And again, I'm going to just breeze through those. And with that, I'm out, and I will toss it back to Roy.
All right. Thank you very much, Steve. But also thank you, Beth, Peter, David, Matt, everybody that contributed to this today. Very appreciative. There was I don't want to say this was really the Cliff Notes version of shoreline permitting, but it is a very complex thing, and hopefully we got a fair amount of information across to you today. The speakers did provide their contact information. I will email everybody afterwards with that same information. We have another workshop on Friday for Lake Ontario, so it might come out after that. Might actually even be January, just with the people that update our website and availability and everything on that. But all of this will be available. We will save the presentations in PDF form so that you will also be able to access those. And we will host those on our website as well. I did not have any questions pop up during the presentations, which is I think that's really good because you guys provided a ton of information. But also I think there's definitely some questions out there. So we've got about 6 to 10 minutes to work with here. So if anybody has any additional questions, please send those through. If not, then I have a couple questions that I could just throw out there. But one thing I'd like to ask the panel, which is all the speakers really, it's kind of an unofficial panel. If there's one thing that you find frustrating and missing from many applications, maybe this is a Beth and David question because they're going to see the most applications come through. What is that? What is the one thing, if you want someone to take one thing away from this meeting today, what would that be?
Beth, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, certainly. So it's hard to, I guess, pinpoint exactly one thing, but I would say definitely the alternatives analysis is something that most applications lack. And, I need to request within that notice of incomplete application. So really detailing why you need your project and what alternatives were considered and how you came to the conclusion that a shoreline structure is required. That background really helps with our analysis and, our review on our end, and it can help, move your application forward quicker.
Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, actually, from a core standpoint, I would say that the kind of the key is, make sure ordinary high water is on the drawing. Make sure you've got the amount of fill and the area of fill you're putting on the drawings and in the application. That's a big thing. Is we don't want to have to guess about that, and you don't want us doing the math.
I had another one in regards to Phil. We did have a comment that says, "Thank you, Beth. There are a lot more of these map CHAs than I realized." I think a lot of people don't really realize that's not something that comes with the papers when you purchase a shoreline property. So that's definitely something we want to help get out there, that there are quite a few CHA areas that people may or may not know about. Regarding fill, is there a standard to well, one, is it defined consistently through agencies, and is there a standard to fill, like what can and cannot be used as fill? So if you have local material, can you use that, or does everything have to come from a certain source?
So from a core standpoint, clean, non-erodible fill, it's certainly evolved in the time that I've been around, and probably Dave's been around, because we're old dinosaurs. But I would say that, the days of old concrete slabs with rebar sticking out, those are gone. Don't do that. And so, does it have to be quarried stone? We don't necessarily go all that way for us, but DEC and the CHA folks may. But, obviously, we don't want people just dumping stuff over the side. We don't want people throwing dirt in the water, and asphalt and those kinds of things. Don't do that.
I think from a DEC perspective, the selection of the materials that you're choosing to build your structure with is really important. The size of the stone is going to be important, and we're not going to want people to use soil, to fill anywhere near the water. If you're using soil, that's going to be placed on the bank in a controlled manner, and probably mulched or covered up somehow so it doesn't erode back into the waterway. And as far as fill goes, we would not typically allow people to borrow material from the shoreline to use as fill.
Now, we only got a few minutes here, but I often do site visits with residents before they get to this point in the process. A lot of times is riprap out in the water that's been pulled off the shoreline by waves and it's just kind of sitting there. Is that something we'd rather see incorporated into the new structure, or leave it there and, bring in all new stuff?
It's not unusual to, as part of a project, Roy, to have somebody go out and grab that material. One of the reasons why it may be out in the lake, because it's undersized. So sometimes that is actually put behind bigger stone, and then it's it's a fill that's protected by larger stone, and so it may be something that can be used, to build an erosion protection structure.
That's great. That's one of the questions I receive most often. Hey, can I use that stone that's already out there? So that's good. That's gonna save me some research time. It is 11:59. Thank you all so much for sticking around for 2 hours of this. I know this is it is a tough topic and you received a lot of information today. Hopefully the information will be useful. If you have any feedback, please send it to me and I will make sure that, if we receive it quick enough, then we can transfer that to the Ontario workshop on Friday. And it's only 4 days away, but maybe we can make that workshop even better, but also future iterations of this workshop. We really want this to be impactful, not just a couple agencies speaking at you about what they want to see. We want to make this permitting process much easier for you to make sure that we are creating sustainable shorelines. So with that, I want to thank the speakers again. Thank you so much. If you guys want to stay on for a few minutes and, post game, then that would be great. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Roy.
And I'll stop recording.
Thanks, Ray.